Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. El día de hoy tengo el gusto de presentarles al profesor Christopher Chase Dunn. Es un profesor que ha dado clases en la Universidad de California. Es experto en la teoría del sistema mundial y nos va a dar una conferencia sobre el declive hegemónico de los Estados Unidos y cómo esto podría afectar a nuestro país y a Latinoamérica. Espero que puedan seguir la transmisión. Veo que en la pantalla están los subtítulos, pero si hay algún problema pueden entrar a la página de YouTube que hace traducción en vivo para que puedan seguir la conferencia. El profesor hablará cerca de 30 o 45 minutos más o menos. Nos dará una perspectiva global, nos hará algunas afirmaciones o argumentaciones que ha desarrollado a lo largo de su carrera y espero que puedan seguir la transmisión y que nos puedan dar alguna retroalimentación al final, algunas preguntas o algunos comentarios sobre la plática. Y bueno, con ustedes el profesor Shesdon.
Gracias, Leopoldo. I want to thank Lorenzo Fusaro for inviting me today to give a lecture on U.S. hegemonic decline. Can I ask a question? How many of you think that the United States empire is in decline? Okay. The problem is its decline is very slow, so it's hard to perceive, although lately it's been getting faster. So I'm sure there's no way we're going to be able to avoid talking about what's happening now in the United States. Okay, we will talk about that. And I want to apologize to you and to Mexico for the behavior of my government. Okay, it's not me, it's these people who are trying to create a fascist state in the United States. We will talk about that. But I want to talk about a larger problem that's been going on much longer, which is the rise and fall of empires. The United States, we don't call it an empire, we call it a hegemony for an important reason. But the long-term history of empires is something I want you to have in mind when I talk about this. This picture that's on the board here shows quantitative measures of the territorial sizes of empires since 3,500 years ago. Okay. 3,500 years ago, the first thing that we call an empire emerged in what's now Iraq, Mesopotamia. It was the Akkadian Empire, but that's it's small in territorial size. It's this tiny little empire. Can you see all understand what I'm saying here? Okay. Then the rest of that is what happened with the territorial sizes of empires, which is that two things happened. They got bigger and they rose and fell. They all rise and fall. Empires do not last. They're fragile. Okay. It's hard to make one and it's hard to keep it going. And they all collapse or go down. But what happens is another empire comes along, either in the same place or not too far away or somewhere else. This process of the rise and fall of empires happened in the old world and in the new world. Okay. It happened in the Middle East, what we call the Middle East now, Mesopotamia and all that for a long time. And then it spread to North Africa. There was an empire in Egypt, and then empires emerged in China, and empires emerged in the New World, in the Americas. Okay. There were several areas where big empires emerged. And in Mexico, the Valley of Mexico, where we are now, and in the country of Mexico, this whole process happened here. They got bigger. They started in down on the coast, the Olmec, and then emerged in the Zapotecs, and the Valley of Mexico went through several rise and fall of empires, okay? The process that happened of the rise and fall of empires in the Americas is not the same as, but is similar to the process of the rise and fall of empires in the old world. It happened later here, but pretty much the same thing happened. They got bigger and then they collapsed. And then there was a period in which there were smaller states and non-states, tribes and people. And then another one emerged. Okay. Exactly how and where and so on is the details are the province of history, but I don't want you to think about the details. I just want you to think about this general pattern of the rise and fall of empires. It's been going on for 3,500 years and affects people because what an empire is basically a structure of authority and power. If you go back before empires, states had emerged before and chiefdoms had emerged before that. The rise and fall of chiefdoms is similar to the rise and fall of empires. They do the same thing, except they're smaller. Okay. But if you go before the rise and fall of chiefdoms, all humans lived in small scale polities, in bands and tribes, and they weren't very big, but they had an authority structure. Also, the other thing that's true if you go back far enough is that human societies were very relatively egalitarian, meaning there wasn't much inequality among the people. Okay. So two things happened at the same time. When empires, states and empires were getting bigger, human societies were getting more unequal. Classes emerged. The original small scale human societies did not have classes. They had families that were more or less equal. Okay. Inequality emerged at the same time that political entities, structures of authority were getting larger. Okay. And those two things interacted with one another. So inequality is not a natural human characteristic that comes out of human nature and so on. It was invented. And same with authority structures. Authority structures are people going along with the rules created by some entity, a state or an empire, the law, property, institutions, all that stuff. All these things are human inventions. They're not natural. This all happened over a period of about 10,000 years. The empires only started 3,500 years ago. But before that was a long process of authority structures getting bigger and societies getting more unequal. Okay. And that process is continuing now. We're living in that process. Okay. We haven't escaped this at all. US hegemonic decline is just like the decline of the British Empire, except that the British Empire was somewhat different. In the late 18th and 19th century, it was the time that there was a global hegemon called the United Kingdom of Great Britain. It had a colonial empire, but its power went beyond its colonies. It had power over the other powerful states on earth. And what I want to do is compare the US hegemony empire to that, because what I'm interested in is the evolution of empires, how they change over time. They don't just get bigger and more unequal. The institutional way in which authority is legitimated evolves. Okay. The interesting thing about the US, have formal colonies. Why not? Why didn't the US have colonies? Anybody know? What do you think? You must know something about US history. Yeah. Sure. That's true. A lot of things changed besides what I'm going to talk about. But the main thing that changed was the US was a set of colonies, wasn't it? It was 13 British colonies. And in 1776, what did they do? They threw the British out. The Mexicans threw the Spanish out in 1821. There was a world revolution around the French Revolution, but with the same ideas in the United States and in Mexico, and it happened in Haiti, in the Caribbean, in all of the Bolivarian Revolution was part of one big world historical event in which colonies sent the colonial government home and became independent countries. The US history was actually an important part of that because the United States did it first in 1776. And then it spread. But it was a consequence of both the evolution of capitalism, capitalism was changing, and the evolution of politics and of ideas about authority. Okay, it was a different idea about authority that came out of the French Revolution called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the purpose of government is to serve the needs of the people. That's the idea. Before that, there were completely different ideas about why people were supposed to obey the government. It was the divine right of kings and stuff like that. Okay. This new idea spread, not all, everywhere, but to a lot of places, and they decolonized. They sent their colonial governors home. It started in the United States. The United States' own history is why it didn't have a colonial empire. But what it did was it used the idea of decolonization to build its empire. That's how it did it. Okay. And it took a long time for this to happen, but it started in 1820 with the Monroe Doctrine, in which the US government passed a law that said that Europeans should not interfere in the Americas. Now, in 1820, the US government wasn't very powerful. It was barely surviving. Okay. The British had been trying to take it back, all this. I'm not going to go through US history here, but let me show you another picture. This is, where we go? Okay, well, this one is decolonization. It's just counting the number of decolonizations from like 1750 to the year 2000. So there's waves of decolonization. This wave I just talked about was the big one that happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that's that first thing. That big pink thing is Spanish colonies. The purple thing is Portuguese colonies. But that little bump right at the very beginning, right in the back, that's the United States. Okay. And then the rest of the world decolonized after that. It just took a long time. The last big wave was after World War II. So this idea that people should have sovereignty over their own government spread to the whole world. And now really, it was the abolition of colonial imperialism. Okay. It was abolished by people rebelling against imperialism. But the ideas were ideas about national sovereignty and that people should have control over their own governments. Those were the ideas that happened. This was a worldwide thing. The United States built its hegemony around this idea. It's too much. All right. This is another quantitative count of this territorial size of the United States. And it starts in 1700 before there was a United States. There's 13 colonies, 13 British colonies. But the point is, it goes up. It's a nice S curve. This is the rise of the United States. It shows its territorial size. But what it doesn't, it also shows is what happened when the United States conquered more land, which is that for the most part, it didn't turn those conquests into colonies, it turned them into states. So California was part of Mexico, wasn't it? But California became not a colony of a country on the East Coast. It became a state in the United States federal government with 2 senators and a governor like all the other states. This is a different kind of imperialism. The other thing is the US didn't stop intervening militarily in the rest of the world. It intervened intermittently when it had to, okay, or when it thought it had to, but it didn't turn its interventions into colonies. It was temporary. He sent the Marines repeatedly to Haiti, but it never made Haiti a colony of the United States, okay? There are exceptions to the colony idea, right? What is Puerto Rico? What is Guam? Okay, there are exceptions, but for the most part, it's not a colonial empire. And the way that it spread and became a global empire is by making a deal with people all over the world who wanted decolonization. And the deal was this: we will help you get rid of the Dutch or the French or the British, but we want to put a military base in your country. And we want you to trade with us. And we want to be able for our capitalists to invest in your country. That's the deal. And then we'll let you do what you want as long as you go along with those things. If you don't go along with them, we will send in the Marines. Guatemala, 1954, okay? It isn't that we don't use military power, we do use it. We just don't use it to create a colonial empire. Okay, but what is that? That's the evolution of imperialism. It's a whole new way of doing a global empire. It also has costs. When the British Empire started to decline, which it did in the middle of the 19th century, it had a huge, India was a colony of Britain. It could use soldiers from India as part of its army. It could tax India, okay? The form of US empire does not allow that. That's why we have Donald Trump. And Donald wishes that we could tax everybody, wants to, but it's not legitimate and he can't do it. He can just say, we're the center of everything and we want to do it, but he can't really do it, okay? So empires have, like any complicated institution, costs and benefits. They have income and outcome, okay? The income comes mainly in a modern capitalist world from the ability to produce, have a comparative advantage in production and produce things that people in the rest of the world will buy from you. The US had that kind of hegemony until the 1970s. What happened in the 1970s was Germany and Japan caught up with the US in manufacturing, and the profit rate in manufacturing went down. So the US had to invent some new tricks to maintain its financial centrality in the world. But basically, it was losing economic centrality because it was no longer the center of capitalist accumulation in the world after that. I have some slides to show you about that. Uh-oh. Hello. I'll just tell you. Don't worry about the slides. The peak of US hegemony in both military and economic power was 1945. What happened in 1945? It was the end of World War II. All the other major great powers of the earth were just devastated by war. The US military was intact and in pretty good shape, as good a shape as it had ever been, okay? The US economy was in really good shape too, because it hadn't been bombed. So the US could take over the world in manufacturing, and it had a superiority in military power far greater than anybody else. There it is. These are two lines here. One is China, the other is the United States. The top blue lines are the United States. And this is not since 1945, it's more recent. But it doesn't show the peak I'm talking about. But basically, you can see the US going down, but it's going down slowly in both military power and in GDP, which is a measure of economic size, really. Okay. These are shares of global military expenditures and global GDP for both China and the United States. Shares. This is not the total amount, it's the relative amount. So the denominator is the global GDP. How do you get that? You add up all the national GDPs, okay? For military expenditures, you do it the same way. Add up all the military expenditures and then see how that's changing over time. How are the shares changing? So what's happening is basically the big news here when you look at shares is the US is coming down, China is coming up, but it's still got a long way to go. Now, there's a bunch of complications here about how you measure things, and I don't have time to talk about that. I may do not time. But the main thing I want to point out is, yeah, the US is going down, China is coming up, but China still hasn't caught the US in either economic power or military power. That solid line is military power, okay? And it's got a ways to go in military power. By the way, these are the only two countries on earth that really matter when you're looking at shares. India is coming up, but it's the only country that's coming up. The other thing to say is the European Union and Europe are also going down. It's not just the US, okay? Why is this? In share terms, it's because there are challengers rising. That's why the share total goes down. It's not absolute decrease, it's relative, okay? The implication here is we're probably not the US going to have a war with China, the US and China, for a while, because what the international relations political scientists think is wars happen when those lines cross. Okay, you have a lot of uncertainty among the people who are making decisions about whether they go to war or not, whether they have arms races all the time, but they don't know whether they're ahead or behind or so on. That's when you can have a war. Now, the good news is we haven't really had a world war since 1945. We've had little proxy wars. We have a lot of wars. There's a lot of wars, but they're not world wars. A world war is a war among the so-called great powers, meaning the ones that have big, powerful militaries. Okay. That's a different thing. And of course, we don't want that because we have weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons and other weapons, which will kill large numbers of people in lots of places wherever the war takes place. So nobody wants another world war. We don't want it. What this implies is it's not really dangerous right now, despite what people on TV say who have been appointed to power in the United States. Okay. However, it will eventually get to a point around 2040, the people who do projections of this, where it will be a danger period for that kind of global warfare. Anyway, the point I was making is hegemony or empire or whatever you want to call it has both benefits and costs. The benefits started going down when the United States was no longer the center of global capital accumulation in manufacturing, material production. Because what happened was financialization, which is basically the manipulation of money, but it's a little bit unstable. It depends on the trust of a bunch of people who have money. And their trust is easily eroded by weird things that happen, like what's happening in the United States. So it's not a very solid basis for an empire. Let's just put it that way. The solid basis for the US empire has been going down since 1945 and in big trouble since 1970. And then the US has a bunch of advantages in the world economy. The most important one is we print world money. Is that a good deal? Yeah, it's a really good deal. Okay. The US dollar is world money, and there's no other currency big enough to replace it yet. Everybody knows that's not going to last forever, but what we don't know is when will it collapse? If you look at the British, what happened was they had the same thing until 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference, in which the guy representing the United States told John Maynard Keynes to go home. And US dollar became world money, and the British dollar was no longer really world money, although it still is a what they call a currency, a reserve currency. Okay, world monies don't really go away. The Dutch guilder is still world currency 400 years after the Dutch hegemony. So, but what they do is they don't give the country who prints them the same advantages as when you can. And then the other thing is the United States uses financial threats and to try to control other countries. That's not real good for investors who are trying to trust money either. In fact, it erodes it. But they're using sanctions, financial sanctions, to try to control all kinds of countries, including Nicaragua and Iran and so on, that they don't like. Okay. The evolutionary point I would make about financial sanctions is it's better than the Marines. All right, where were we? Yeah, okay. This is a whole list where I'm trying to say how comparing the US with earlier hegemonies and empires, how it was different. The tricky part here is it may sound a little bit like exceptionalism. All empires make up a story about how they are the greatest thing that ever lived, and it's different from earlier empires and all that. They all do that. It's propaganda. You've got to have a story about your power that makes it sound like you're doing things that are helpful to people. Okay, it's called ideological hegemony. Okay, Antonio Gramsci wrote a whole bunch of stuff about this, but it works at the international level too. There are world orders in which the great powers at least more or less agree on what legitimates authority. And every hegemony and empire has to do that. Because if you rely entirely on either economic and military power, it doesn't work. It's too expensive. You can't force people, use force to get everybody to do what you want them to do. You have to either get them to agree with your legitimation of hierarchy and go along with the rules, or to not care too much about it, not be worried about thinking about their own problems, to take care of their family and going playing with their phone and stuff. Okay. There's a lot of ways to keep people from being involved in politics. That's what ideology does. It legitimates power, and it sort of creates something that people take for granted. That's how ideas work as an institution. And ideas evolve. And Gramsci analyzed that for what was happening in Europe when he was in prison and stuff, but a whole bunch of people have applied this to international relations, a Gramscian analysis of power in the world. And it works the same way. An empire requires a legitimation. It requires a universalistic ideology, like free trade. Okay, free trade is just an ideology, but it's one that a lot of people believe in, including most economists, and it's allegedly something that's good for everybody, not just for some elite or something. Okay, so all U.S. hegemony has importantly deployed an ideology about the free world and about democracy and all this stuff. Okay, now what we see going on with Trump is he's wrecking the ideology, but it did work for a very long time in combination with economic power and military power. So it was a pretty good ideology. There was a big struggle with communism and socialism in the Soviet Union and all that. But the US basically won that struggle. And we have a world in which capitalist ideology, capitalist realism is the predominant, powerful, hegemonic form of global culture. Okay, that's the reality we live in. Most people think that markets and free trade and all this stuff are good for everybody, and they all kind of go along with it, and they just want to be left alone so that they can play with their cell phones. So capitalist ideology has become embedded in a world order. It's not really only the United States. The United States helped create that world order through building a bunch of institutions like the UN and the, am I running out of time? I'm gonna do it. Okay. All right. So that's the picture I want to build about US hegemonic decline. It's happening. It's been happening. It's not new. It's been slowly declining since 1945. The other thing I was going to try to talk about is what should Latin Americans and Mexicans do about this? Why is this a problem for you, and what could you possibly do about it? Okay. The Trump regime is going to be the major topic of conversation here, but the Trump regime for me is just an acceleration of a process that was already going on, and that is a consequence of that process. The reason why the MAGA people and so on have been able to get power in the United States is because there's a bunch of unhappy people in the United States. Why? Because they lost their jobs, because the jobs moved to Mexico and the global South. Okay, that's why. And they're unhappy about this. And so beating up on immigrants and so on sort of appeals to these people. And there's also a racial aspect to it, of the Christian nationalism and all these things about the ability to mobilize a movement to basically create a monarchy in the United States, or fascism, whatever you want to call it. Right. But I see all that as a consequence of US hegemonic decline that is accelerating US hegemonic decline. And when you look at empires comparatively, they almost all do this. They start to do really crazy things during the period of decline. We call this imperial overreach. They make wars that don't make any sense. They spend a lot of money on projects that don't make any sense. It's desperation, basically. Things aren't going well. There's a lot of conflict within the country, and people disagreeing with each other. There's potential for civil wars occurring, and the government is trying to save the situation and coming up with all kind of crazy shit. And there are social movements of people who are not happy and are willing to support leaders that say that they're going to fix it for them. Okay, that's explains Donald Trump. Now, okay, what does Donald Trump mean, and what does U.S. hegemonic decline mean for you and for Mexico? Okay, it means you probably need to think about getting along without the United States. Not going to be any help in climate change. So climate change is coming. It's a catastrophe. It's going to be really bad. And we have to figure out how to deal with it in some kind of sensible way. But at least for a while, the United States is not going to be any help, because the people who are running it are just causing trouble in the United States. And there's going to be a big fight about that. Maybe a civil war, maybe a fascist regime for a while. I don't know. Okay. In the long run, it will sort out. And I think that at least the US will return to some kind of electoral democracy. But that's just me guessing. I don't know what's going to happen. Everything is happening really fast. I made this PowerPoint 2 weeks ago. It's already obsolete about all kinds of stuff because I'm from California. How many of you know people in the United States now? Okay, gotcha. Or how about in California? Okay. All right, California is blowing up because the Trump administration wants it to. They're creating a situation where they can declare martial law and send in the troops, and they're doing it. They're unloading tanks in Los Angeles right now. Okay. This is a very dire situation, and we're going to deal with it, and you don't need to worry about it too much, but it could go in some very bad directions that could be painful for a lot of people. The main problem for you is it's going to collapse a huge chunk of your economy. Okay. All the stuff that's being manufactured in Puebla to export to the United States might not be anybody that can afford to buy it. So you need to be thinking about alternatives. Who's going to buy Ram trucks if the gringos don't buy them? Nobody else is stupid enough to buy Ram trucks. So that's going to be a problem. So you need to think about exporting something else to somebody and having jobs for people, because the Ram truck factory is going to be shut down, and all those people that work there are going to have families that are starving. That's probably going to happen. Okay. NAFTA created industrialized parts of Mexico, and that part, when the world, when the US economy collapses and the world economy collapses for a while, you need to be thinking about what are you going to do about those people? What are they going to do next? And what makes sense is other markets that aren't, think about what the Chinese might be able to buy that they don't already produce, things of that kind. Okay, so be thinking ahead a few moves. If you have relatives in the States, you don't, but if you did, I don't think you could, there's very much you could do to support those people other than just sending them your support. Okay. They are in a very tough situation. I feel bad for my neighbors in Southern California. They are scared. Okay. And I'm going to try and help them. And I'm going to try and help resolve this situation in the United States, but it might not be real soon that this gets sorted out. Okay. That's it.
Bueno, muchas gracias, profesor, por su conferencia. Me parece que ha tocado muchos puntos que son muy interesantes para los estudiantes, bueno, y para todos los que estamos aquí. En este momento abrimos una ronda de preguntas. If you want, we can accept, una ronda de preguntas para el profesor sobre el tema o sobre algo que les interese relacionado a la hegemonía de Estados Unidos y su relación con China. No sé si alguien quiere participar. Adelante. ¿Se escucha? Sí.
Pues antes que nada, gracias por su tiempo, doctor. Gracias por la disculpa, realmente la apreciamos. Y quería preguntarle cuáles son las principales señales del comienzo de la caída del imperio. Thank you for your time, doctor. I really appreciate your apologies. I know that our government is complicated, but thank you. My question is, which are the principal signals of the beginning, the fall of empires?
Right, I get it. I didn't talk about explanations very much. Right? I talked about how these things have been managed. Okay, there are demographic and material processes that make empires possible and that also cause their decline. Demography is just population change, right? Population growth. And what happens is empires, political things get together and population grows because the empire is helpful in producing material things for people so they can have more kids and more kids can survive. But what happens is overshoot in population growth. Okay, too many, and it costs more. That's part of it. The other thing is the state is able to tax people and some elites who support it. So it has a fiscal basis, but when the population growth gets too much, the state runs into fiscal problems of the ability to have enough taxes. The other thing is the elites expand. There's a growth of people who want to be in the elite, the aristocracy or the nobility or whatever it is, or the capitalists, okay? And so they start competing with one another. And so you end up with a situation where you've got a bunch of unhappy population masses and unhappy elites who are competing with one another. And that's when you get collapse. The state collapses. There's fighting. There's a mess. Okay. And then there's a whole other story about how that turns back into rise again, because it always does. But that's the story of collapse. There's a theory. It's called structural demography that explains this. Okay. Now, it's not to say there aren't other things that happen that are important too, but that's the basic material basis of it right there.
Gracias. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna otra pregunta, compañero? Sí, te van a pasar el micrófono. No se escucha. No creo que está. Bueno.
Buenos días. Me gustaría preguntarle si habría alguna posibilidad de futuro para México en los BRICS, en el grupo económico de países llamado BRICS, pensando como una alternativa a la dependencia económica de Estados Unidos. Ahora justo que los BRICS están en expansión, ¿no? Y son conocidos como un grupo anti-occidente o anti-imperialista, por así decir. So my question is if there is an alternative future for Mexico in the BRICS group, so that as an alternative for the economic dependency with the United States. Talking about that, nowadays the BRICS are known as antioxidant group, and they're expanding. Sorry, that's it.
Okay. Actually, I meant to mention that in my ideas about opportunities for Mexico and Latin America, but I forgot. But okay, what we know is when the global north countries are fighting with one another, it's basically an opportunity for some countries in the global south. That's what happened before. It happened during World War II. Okay. Latin America was able to industrialize more than it had been when the great so-called great powers were not fighting with one another. So there are opportunities. It's less dependence. Okay. It's what you said. Now, the dependence that we have is different than it was then, but it's also similar. It was economic dependence. Okay. It's the difference is it's manufacturing now, a bunch of it. And then it wasn't. There wasn't much manufacturing going on in Mexico. There was oil and all that stuff. A lot was happening in different parts of Latin America, but what happened was import substitution. And this continued for quite a while, and there were policies for doing it. Okay, so there was an opportunity. The other thing to say is the whole global south doesn't necessarily benefit from this. It's the ones who can figure out how to do something that is good for the country. Regarding the BRICS and the G20 and all that, you know, we're involved in a bunch of really interesting politics here that is heavily impacted by the decline of the US and by crazy Donald Trump. They're having meetings in the G20 in which he's threatening to resign from the G20, which would probably be the best thing that could happen for the G20, okay? Because without the US obstructing everything that they try to do, they could actually do some really important things. And the BRICS, the problem with the BRICS countries is it's mostly just performance politics at this point. They haven't actually done the things that they've said that they might do. And part of the reason that that is true is because they're all controlled by oligarchs who are pretty conservative and just want to maintain their power and their wealth. And they have, I happen to know a lot about South Africa because a friend of mine lives there in Johannesburg. The president of South Africa is supposedly a supporter of the BRICS, but he's not. He's just, he says he is, and he has done some good things about Palestine and stuff. But the things that they've really been threatening about are about de-dollarization. They've mentioned that, but they haven't actually done it. Their idea, the bank that they created is pretty similar and is working with all the banks in New York. So the problem is their oligarchy, that what they need is to have revolutions in the BRICS countries in which people create governments that support and promote the lives of the people of the country rather than a bunch of rich people who are running the country. That's the problem with the BRICS, okay? My friends in South Africa are extremely aware about this, and they keep having BRICS meetings there and so on. And of course, the other thing about the BRICS, this is weird, is that they're competing and fighting with each other. The Chinese and the Indians have a war going on their border, okay? So how are they supposed to cooperate in an organization called the BRICS? And Russia Okay, Russia's a wild card and it's all over the place, and who knows what the deal is there. But Putin held a meeting of the BRICS in which he backed down on de-dollarization. He had this idea he was going to create his own cryptocurrency and so on, but he never did it. So the BRICS are, it's hopeful, and I know there's a lot of people on the left very hopeful that the BRICS are going to be a progressive force in world politics, but there's also a lot of reasons to suspect that that's not the case, that it's a bunch of capitalists who want a bigger share of the pie, but they're not really going to change much except move things around a little bit. Now, could that be useful? Maybe, but it's not necessary to, oppose U.S. hegemony because it's imploding anyway, right? That's it. You shouldn't get a lot of points for that. The real problem is, what are we going to do within countries to support people, and what are we going to do internationally to help one another do that? And that's a world which is possible. It will happen, but not real soon, probably. Okay. I think there will be a world socialist society eventually, if we survive this war stuff. If we don't all kill each other, that will eventually emerge. But remember, I think about 10,000 years and stuff, right? So I'm not saying this is going to happen soon. Right now, we're going exactly in the opposite direction. It's the coming of World War V and economic nationalism. And I get it why people do this, but it's not the answer, okay? Economic nationalism happened already before. It was a really big disaster when it happened in the 1930s. And I understand. I would say you've got to do something like that. Take care of your own people. But the question is, how do you do it in a world that's already globalized, in which everybody's connected with everybody else? And that's tricky. Okay. But it's something that we do need to figure out. Got to figure it out.
Bueno, gracias. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna otra pregunta? ¿Algo que quieran saber? ¿No? Bueno, profesor, bueno, les digo mi pregunta en español y luego se la pregunto en inglés. A mí me gustaría saber si las acciones de Donald Trump son una forma de mostrar hegemonía, o si está tratando, o si solo está actuando de forma errónea. Y la siguiente que le voy a preguntar es si nosotros conocemos el pasado, cómo han terminado los imperios, ¿cuál podría ser la predicción hacia el futuro con el imperio de Estados Unidos? Esas serían mis preguntas. Professor, I have two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, Donald Trump is acting in a way to show that USA is still the empire, or is an irrational behavior.
Yeah.
And the second one is, we know what happened with the empires in the past, when these empires ends up. What happened when we know what happened with these empires, but with this experience, we can predict what will happen with USA as an empire.
Yeah.
And that's my question.
Okay. Well, we're trying to talk about the future here, and this is very tricky, because what we know, if we pay close attention to human history, is it's conjunctural. Weird things happen that you couldn't predict because they happen accident. Two things that are unrelated happen at the same time, but they affect one another. This happens over and over again. Okay. When you stand back from that and just look at the big picture, that was the first thing that I pointed to about empires rising and falling. What that doesn't tell you is when it's going to happen and who's going to do it and all that. All right. So when we try to talk about what's going to happen in the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or something, we're really just kind of speculating. Okay. In the long run, when I say that, I will predict that another set of great powers will emerge on Earth, and there will be another hegemony, or there will be a world government. It could be either of those, okay, in the next round. Or the world government might not happen in the next round. It might happen in the round that follows that. So by the year 4000, there will probably be a single government on Earth that's a federation, in which Mexico is a state in that government, okay? what kind of government will it be? Will it be a government of rich people? Will it be a socialist state, democratic socialist state? What will it be? Well, we sure don't know. We don't even know whether, when, and what. Right? There's no point in talking about too much about that. The only thing I will say is, I think that evolution has tendencies, human sociocultural evolution, not biological evolution, that mean that even if the disasters kill off a large proportion of the human population, the process will just start up again. You following me here? It's like big catastrophes that have happened in the past when 50 or 60% of the population is killed. The Black Death in Europe and in China, okay? Yeah, but it changed a bunch of things, but it reemerged and it kept on going. So World War will be like that. That's how it will be. It will set things way back. It'll be hard to figure. It will be hard to survive. People will have a hard time, but they'll start over and they will come pretty much go through the same set of sequences and end up back where we are now. So the real question now is not, are we going to survive? It's how are we going to keep on going and not backslide into a collapse that takes a long time to recover from. That's the issue. And it's going to be tough because we have not only the normal process of rise and fall, we have a global climate change, which is going to be really bad, make big swaths of the earth uninhabitable. Talk about migration. Okay. We haven't even seen migration yet. Okay. Whole parts of the tropics are going to be uninhabitable. You can't live there without air conditioning. Okay. And air conditioning just makes things worse usually because you have to burn fossil fuels to do it. So there's some really bad shit happening. And the United States some people in the United States were trying to play a good role in this, but our government is no longer doing it. They say they don't even believe this. Okay. And there are questions about how and when and how fast and all that. There's no doubt about it. We don't really know for sure, but we have a pretty good idea when this is coming. And it's between, it's the rest of this century, basically. That's going to really shake things up. Who can survive and deal, and how can we work together to try to preserve some kind of civilization in a situation like that? That's huge. I'm afraid you shouldn't depend on the United States being much help here because we've got our own mishigas because of U.S. hegemonic decline. We've got problems that we have to deal with. And frankly, I don't think anybody else can help us with these things much. Okay. You can say, okay, well, that's good. Try to keep going on that. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm really skeptical about it could be short or long. The Trump administration looked like it was imploding, and then now they've diverted attention again by beating people up in California and sending in tanks and stuff. Okay, so they're good at that. They just changed the discourse immediately by doing something outrageous, and that will continue, and it might work. It depends on two things: how many people in the United States support it, and what does the military do? And we don't know the answer. Okay, the important political player everywhere is the military. What we don't know about the United States is what the military is going to do. The good news is Donald Trump has been basically insulting them his whole career. He says these nasty things about them. So hopefully that means that the officer corps and the soldiers will not shoot down our citizens, but we don't know what's going to happen. The test case is happening right now in California. So I don't know what's going on in my own country. I know I'm going to but I'm an old guy. I didn't sign up for this. Okay. I preferred the United States where we could just take everything for granted and everything was humming along and everything was great. And you didn't really have to worry about a fascist takeover, but that's no longer done. And I'm going to try to do my part. I am, to try to prevent this. But frankly, is there very much people can do? Those people in Mexico who have relatives or friends who live in the United States can try to support them, because those people are really screwed right now and they are afraid. What they should know that could be helpful is it's mainly a distraction for Trump to try to take over sectors of power in the United States. and mobilize a bunch of people who think that immigrants are the source of some kind of problem. Okay. That's really all it is. It's a distraction, but it's sort of working and as a distraction. But people who are in the US illegally should know, it would be helpful for them to know that. Okay. They aren't actually going to deport 3 million people, because if they did, the whole US economy would collapse. These are the people that do the work. Okay. They can't. So anyway, I don't know how this is all going to turn out. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Bueno, ¿alguien tiene alguna otra pregunta ya para que terminemos? Sí.
Lo voy a hacer primero en español y luego en inglés, ¿vale? Entiendo que es difícil entiendo que es complicado ver a futuro los resultados de la política al exterior que tiene Estados Unidos con el resto del mundo, específicamente con Latinoamérica. Entonces, ¿no sería, o cuál es lo que opina usted en relación a la economía social como una alternativa para sobrepasar este tipo de problemas a nivel productivo, en el que nos empecemos a relacionar de una forma distinta con nuestro entorno y en la forma en la que producimos? Entonces, ahí va en inglés. I think that it's kind of tricky to think to the future with the outcome of the foreign policy of the United States right now and the effects that it had in Latin America. Don't you think that social economy it's a way to overcome those problems in the way that we relate with the nature and in the society in terms of how we produce, and maybe it have a good impact in the economy and the way we relate, we have a relationship with others?
Yes.
What do you think about that?
I think that the situation we have, if by the idea of social economy you mean our relationships with our families and our local community, but then keep going, because the real world that we live in is a global world. Okay, so then that raises the issue about what does it mean about international trade and all that stuff. And you can't really ignore that question. So by just focusing on what you're doing with your local community, because the question then becomes, how are the local communities relating with each other? What's going on there? Okay, and then how is that operating in institutions that are larger and in the state and all that? Because those institutions are probably not going away, although sometimes they go away temporarily, but they don't go away very long. They come back. So then the question is, well, how does that work? So you don't really exactly solve all the problems by saying you're going to do the social economy, unless you mean those things. And also applies to international trade and international politics. Okay. When you have a situation like Mexico has, where it's an integral part of a North American economy and a pretty integral part of a global economy, what does social economy mean when you have to make decisions about people who are building Ram trucks in Puebla? I mean, I don't know, but I think that's an important question. And I think it has all kinds of implications for what are good policies in Mexico. Okay. I know there's a lot of critique of government projects and all this stuff, and I get it. But if you aren't going to do that, what are you going to do? And who are you going to trade with? And what do they need from you? And what do you need from them? All those things need to be fixed and solved. And the only thing I can say is don't depend too much for help on help. We've got our own problem. You'll be lucky if we don't implode, because if we do, all those people in Puebla are out of work. don't sell Ram trucks to anybody else. What a Ram truck is, big monster truck about as big as this room, okay? That people in the United States buy and then drive around on streets in town and stuff. It's like stupid. But what are you gonna do with that whole industry and all those people? Manufacturing is a good thing. The people of the earth need manufacturing things. They do. They need vehicles. So how are you going to, and what are you going to produce? Who are you going to sell it to? And what kind of deal will that be? Who's going to make those decisions? So all that to me is implied in the idea of a social economy. I'm a socialist, but I believe in world socialism. And world socialism probably not going to emerge very soon. The most likely thing is another weird incarnation of capitalism, I think, in the next round. It won't be capitalism as it has been, and it won't be socialism. It'll be some weird version of capitalism. Here's the thing about capitalism. It's very flexible. This is what we know about it. Capitalism is amazingly able to adjust to the problem it creates. And I don't think that's over. The Chinese are, I'm sorry, but it's a form of capitalism. It's state capitalism, basically, with an authoritarian government right now. But how long is that going to last in China? The party in China is totally dependent on its ability to make the middle class happy. And if it doesn't do that, they're going to be done with the Chinese Communist Party. And then the question is, what's the next regime after that? Or the whole place falls apart into warlordism, which it historically does over and over again, and which nobody wants. Even the CIA doesn't want that, okay? So what's going to happen when the shit hits the fan with the current regime in China? I don't know, but it will be important. It might be okay. There's a lot of different things they could do and learn from other people who have gone through similar things. But I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. I wouldn't predict a long lifespan for the Chinese Communist Party because they've already been in power too long. Can't stay in power. Got to move on. Have a plan for that. They don't seem to be thinking about it. I don't know what's going to happen, but what I see is there's a wave of authoritarianism, isn't there? It's not just the United States and it's not just Latin America, it's Europe, and this is happening. The good news is this has all happened before. It happened in the 1920s and the 1930s. We call it fascism, but it didn't last forever. And the trend toward some kind of electoral democracy continued. And that's probably what's going to happen this time. Okay. And there's research that shows this. There's an outfit called VDEM in Sweden that studies regime change. And they show these waves of autocracy that have happened before, and they last from 15 or 20 years. And then you go back to more electoral democracy. So that might be what happens this time. The problem is we don't know how long the period of the time of troubles is going to last, and it's impossible to predict. And it could be short or it could be long. My colleagues that I work with who study this sociocultural evolution, some of them say we're going to have a civil war in the United States and it's going to go on for 40 years. Okay. I don't know whether that's right or not. I would prefer that we get all this settled in the next 4 years, but maybe that's not going to happen. Like I said, what it depends on is the military and social movements in the United States and people. What do they do? And I don't know what they're going to do. But did I answer your question about social economy? Did you get it? What I said? You want to respond to that?
No, pero you give me another way to think how social economy it can overcome some problems in terms of the production, social production, and the way we interchange. But thank you. Me abrió mucho los ojos esa respuesta. Gracias.
Bueno, ¿alguien más quiere preguntar algo? Bueno, si no es así, les agradecemos mucho que nos hayan acompañado el día de hoy a la conferencia. En nombre del profesor Lorenzo Fusaro, del Departamento de Economía y del área de Sociedad y Acumulación Capitalista, muchas gracias. Ahora en inglés. Professor, I want to say thank you very much for being here with us. Your conference was really interesting, and I think most of the students have another perspective now about the hegemony in USA. Thank you very much, and I say thank you also for Lorenzo Fusaro, the Department of Economy, and all of all of our professors. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
If anybody wants to come up and ask me a question later, that's fine too.
Okay.
We can shut down now until people can go get their lunch.
Sí. Bueno, dijo que sí, si tienen alguna pregunta después, se la pueden enviar. Nosotros podremos ponerlos en contacto con el profesor vía correo electrónico. Bueno, que ya también es tiempo de comer. Bueno, muchas gracias y nos vemos pronto. Que tengan excelente día.